Finance Administration Committee to order, and first order of business is roll call, please.
Teresa Taylor.
Here.
David Miller.
Here.
Margaret Brown.
Here.
Henry Jones.
Here.
Matthew Saha for Fiona Ma. Jason Perez. Lynn Paquin for Betty Yee.
All right. Next is approval of the November 19th, 2019 Finance Administration Committee timed agenda. What is
Approval.
It's been moved by Ms. Brown, seconded by Mr. Miller. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. Our next is the executive report. Mr. Cohen.
Thanks, Chair. Taylor, Michael Cohen with CalPERS. Just a few news and notes from the financial side of CalPERS. First of all, item 5D, the reporting on participating employers. There was an update to the materials the middle to late last week's, so the board members should have those. There's copies in the back for anyone who didn't get those. Second, last time we were here, I mentioned that we had our first employer join our new pension pre-funding trust fund. I'm happy to report that we've had 2 additional employers join since the last time we met, so that program continues to gain momentum. And third and finally, CalPERS has signed its first cyber security insurance policy for $50 million of coverage. So that's new for the organization, and we're excited to have that in place at this point. So with that, Chair, I'll turn it back to you for the consent items.
Great, thank you very much. I just want to bring to the attention of the court reporter that also attending is Mr. Fechner, Ms. Ortega, Mr. Rubalcava, and Ms. Middleton. Oh, and I didn't see you there. Stacy, yes, Stacy Oliveras, thank you. All right. Our next is our action consent items. What is the, I got it moved by Mr. Miller, second by Mr. Jones. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, motion carries. Our next is our information consent items. I didn't get anything on pulling anything off, so we're going to move on to our action agenda items. 6A, basic financial statements. Mr. Cohen and Ms. Nix.
Yes, let me have Michelle Nix, the CalPERS controller, walk you through the presentation here on our financial statements.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the Finance and Administration Committee. My name is Michelle Nix, CalPERS Controller. I'm pleased to present the basic financial statements for the year ending June 30th, 2019. These statements, when they are approved by you, will be included in the final CAFR for the year ending for the fiscal year. I would also like to acknowledge the financial reporting and accounting team who worked hard to put these statements together and to get the statements ready for audit. Now I'd like to go over a few of the highlights of the financials with you. So most importantly, we ended the year with net assets of $372.6 billion. And our annual money-weighted rate of return was 6.5%. So that's kind of important to know. On our next slide, we talk about the net position and why we got there. The PERF's net position increased $18.6 billion, or 5.3%. Last year it was $354 billion, and this year it's $372.6 billion, as I said, at the end of June. Over the 10-year period, we have increased our net position by $171 billion, or 84.8%. So some of the things that contributed to this change, additions to the PERF's net position, include investment income, employer and member contributions. Investment income is comprised of dividend income, interest income, and net appreciation or depreciation of the fair value of the investments. Net investment income was $23 billion in fiscal year 2018-19, and that's compared to $27.4 billion at the end of last fiscal year, due to lower investment return experience this year than over last year. Employer contributions decreased by $4.3 billion, or 21.6%. This is due to receiving additional payments for unfunded liabilities from employers, as well as a large state supplemental payment in the last fiscal year that we didn't receive this year. Employer contribution rates increased 0.9% and up to 2.8% for the state, 2.5% for schools, and 2% to 3.1% on average for public agency miscellaneous and safety plans. Member contributions increased $0.2 billion, or 5.7%, because of an increase in total active member count. Deductions from the PERF are comprised of benefit payments, refunds of contributions to members and beneficiaries, and costs of administering the PERF. Benefit payments are the primary expense of the retirement system. In fiscal year 2018-19, retirement, death, and survivor benefit payments increased $1.6 billion, or 6.9%, primarily due to the cost of living increases in benefit payments and due to the increase in the number of retirees and beneficiaries. I'm going to move on to slide 5. So as I said in slide 4, investment income is made up of net appreciation or depreciation of investments, interest income, and dividend income. As the chart shows above, the global debt securities and the global equity securities had the largest gain, so they contributed the most to this. So in the PERF, the annual rates of return, we have 2 rates of return here on this slide. One's time-weighted and one's money-weighted. So you can see that they're comparable from year to year. The time-weighted return, it measures the compounded growth of rate over a period of time while eliminating the distorting effects of inflows and outflows of cash. The time-weighted rate of return is the standard for investment performance. However, the money-weighted rate of return expresses investment performance net of investment expenses based upon the amount of time that the money was actually invested. It's also the GASB reporting requirement, so that's why they're both up there, because GASB requires us to put in our CAFR the money-weighted rate of return, but traditionally the investment return is the time-weighted return. So the unfunded actuarial liability, as you all know, with the actuarial valuation is measured in arrears. So as of June 30th, 2018, it was $150.4 billion. So that's as of June 30th, 2018. The increase in the unfunded actuarial liability over the 10-year period is due to an increase in the actuarial accrued liability, which increased from $294 billion in 2009 to $505 billion at 2018. So it's kind of gradually increased over time. Next, the PERF benefits and contribution income. In FY 18-19, which is the current year, $20.3 billion was received in contributions, while $24.2 billion was paid in benefits. Contributions decreased 16.7% from prior year, primarily due to the additional payments that were made by the employers towards the unfunded liability that was paid in the prior year, and those are voluntary. So with that, the next steps for this would be approval of the basic financial statements, and what will happen is once those are approved, after any questions, then they'll get finalized and put into the CAFR, and we can wrap up the audit. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
All right. Ms. Brown, hold on a second. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the report. I actually read a part of this. I'm not going to say I read all of it. But I'd like to draw your attention to attachment 1, page 479. It's called Financial Highlights. It's in 4-point font, so I don't know if it's a highlight, more of a low light. And this is where you talk about the PERF realized the money-weighted rate of return of 6.5%.
Okay.
Are we there? Yeah, we're going to get there.
Oh, no, they didn't.
I'll wait for you to get there. Or it's I don't know what page it is in your book, or it's, I can't see.
In the very beginning.
76 of 490.
76 of 490, if you get that. I'm not sure where we're at.
Maybe it's
Yeah.
that one.
We've got
We can look that.
here
We
in
can look
front of
that way.
us.
We will
Yeah.
look, and I'm reading
They've got
I'm
it.
reading the actual fine print. I want you to know.
Okay.
So on this little page, you talk about the money-weighted rate of return and versus the time-weighted rate of return. So my first question is, what number gets compared to the 7% discount rate? What becomes the unfunded liability? Is it 0.3 that we missed, 6.7 to 7, or is it 0.5, the 6.5 to 7%? What is the shortfall?
Okay, so there isn't really a shortfall. It's a difference in the methodology for calculating the return. So, for instance, the time-weighted rate of return is the return that's produced over time without the impact of the cash flows that come in and out of the calculation. So, for example, if you had invested $1 in the S&P for a year, you could calculate the time-weighted rate of return, which is also what conventionally the investment managers use, like for the S&P and the indices and our benchmarks. For the money-weighted rate of return, it cares also about when the cash flows come in. So, for instance, it gives more weight to the money in the how long the money has been in there. So, for our dollar example, I would care when I was calculating the money-weighted rate of return, I would care if I had 75 cents out of my dollar for 3/4 of the year and I earned more rate of return, and then I added 25 cents for a lesser return that yielded lesser return, then I would have to calculate using those. And when we go and calculate the actuarial question, I'm going to refer to Scott.
Good afternoon, Scott Tarando, CalPERS staff. When we calculate the cost for the plan, we base it on assets at the end of the year that's allocated. So it's reflective of everything, investment income and all expenses. And, whether you want to take the 6.7 and subtract the expenses, or you make a explicit allowance for expenses, or you make it a net, as we do here in terms of we take the expenses out before. We are basing our contributions and the requirements on the final numbers coming from the financial office. So to answer your question, technically we'd be using a 6.5 at the end of the day.
Right, and I see that.
For the rates.
I see that on page 40 of 79 on that attachment 1A, where we talk about the rate of return being 6.5. And so what I'm trying to figure out, and I think you've answered it for me, the difference between the 6.7 and the 6.5 is all our net, our operating costs. So this is our true net that we earned. And so when we talk to our employers, you're going to be calculating it, right? I assume the actuarial office.
Correct.
The shortfall?
Right, and when we do those calculations, those will be, like, for example, the 6.5 would be reflected in the 2019 valuations, which will come out in 2020 for the public agencies.
You know what's kind of interesting about the CAFR, because I was a little confused why we've been reporting 6.7, but really the net number is 6.5. And of course, I went back through a couple of CAFRs. Last year, we reported both time-weighted and money-weighted, but prior to that, we didn't. We only
All the way to 2014 we did.
I looked at 15, 16, and 16, 17, or 14, 15, and it doesn't appear in the financial highlights. It looks like we only did money weight of return. So I just want to make sure that we are, when we're saying what a good job we've done, that we actually put the correct number out for the public. And so maybe you can explain, someone can explain to me on that same slide, though, why there was no difference between the money weighted and time weighted in 2017. Does anybody know?
It's all about the cash flows, so the computations. Great. I'll let Dan talk about cash flows.
Yeah, so the difference between Dan Bienvenu, Acting Chief Operating Officer, CalPERS staff, the difference between time-weighted and Money weighted has to do with how cash flows are treated. So time weighted is the way something would grow. Say if we're in a mutual fund on a unitized value, it would grow in a time-weighted way, but money-weighted, as Michelle says, is what's consistent with GASB. Our time-weighted return is calculated with GIP standards, which includes the expenses. So I would say the time-weighted is what pays the benefit, so to speak. But to Scott's point on the actuarial, what the actuaries use, because of the fact that the CAFR is GASB compliant and uses money-weighted, that's what we use for, I believe, on the actuarial side.
And is that required under GASB 67, or is it 74? Do we know what requires us to use that money-weighted?
GASB 67.
67, all right, thank you.
All right. Is that Mr. Jones?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I just want to, do you remember when the rules changed under GASB to require this differentiated reporting? Because I know that GASB changed a lot, and even some institutions having to use the Treasury note to talk about their potential deficits when it's not real, but it's required by GASB. So do you remember when GASB implemented?
I believe it was 2015, but we could have implemented it early. I wasn't here. Let me see if Taylor knows.
That would be why we...
Okay,
That's
I can find out when we implemented it.
I'm just trying to highlight that many times the way we report information is because of a requirement, but so we have to use two numbers, and that's the bottom line I was trying to stress.
And GASB did that to be more transparent and clear.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
So let me clarify if I'm understanding this correctly, because I'm a little confused myself. 6.5 is what we're going to do our annualized return on, not the 6.7. Is that correct?
When we do the calculations, we're given an asset value, and then we can calculate what the rate of return is, based on the information. We don't go through and we don't calculate what the exact dollar-weighted rate of return is, because it would be technically different for each plan involved. We calculate like an average rate of return, and it tends to be closer to the dollar-weighted return than the time-weighted return. It's only a difference, like you said, varies
0.2%.
by the expenses by about 10 basis points, 12 basis points, somewhere in there. But when we do the calculations, we don't calculate assets based on the rate of return. We're given the asset number. We're given that the plan has, say, $10 million in their account, and that's what we base the calculations on. We don't calculate investment income. We don't allocate the investment income. We're given those numbers by the financial office. So from our point of view, we calculate what we see as the rate of return, but there's no calculations from our office involved with those numbers.
Basically, that's a yes. 6.5 is what we're figuring our annual rate of return on.
Yes.
Thank you. That's all I wanted to clarify. Go ahead. We can move on.
I'm sorry,
Okay,
I
so
just
that's
want to
what
make
I'm
sure that
confused, 'cause
yes,
that's
I'm
what you
sorry to
just
jump
told
in here.
Margaret.
What I am hearing is that I think that the actuaries don't calculate their contributions and all of that based on returns. They calculate them based on assets, and those assets are inclusive of the contributions and outflows.
So they
because
don't
of those, it
include
causes
the
it to
full
look
expenses of the CAFR then.
because of the fact that it's using assets, it looks like the money-weighted return, but it's not based on returns, it's based on assets. On the return side, the 6.7 is inclusive of the expenses. Right. That's GIPS compliant calculation. They're just different calculations. I think the way to think about it is use an example. If a fund goes from 100, let's say, down to 50, and then there's a big inflow, and then back to 100, the money-weighted return will be 0 because it started at 100 and it ended at 100. It ignores the cash flow. The time-weighted will actually look at the fact that something came in and out. So that's what causes it to look different. But now both will be calculated including the expenses or excluding the expenses, and in the case of CalPERS, ours include the expenses. But when it comes to what the
It's clear as
employers,
mud, guys.
I know, I'm sorry, I'm trying to.
And let me try one more thing. So both numbers are correct. It just is a matter of, are you talking to an investment professional or are you talking to an accounting professional?
Okay.
And so the 6.7, if you were talking to Dan or some of his colleagues, that meets their professional standards. If you move over to an accountant, a 6.5% is going to meet their standards.
Okay.
That's correct.
So, got it. Does that make everything clear for everybody? And Henry, go ahead. Hold on. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And if you compare CalPERS rate of return, 6.7%, to other pension funds and institutions, what number would you use, 6.7 or 6.5?
We would use 6.7, but
Thank you.
candidly, I think it's worth mentioning, CalPERS was very early in the adoption of GIPs of asset owners. We're one of the very first. So even that 6.7 we think is appropriate. We think it's appropriate for us to take a leadership position in these GIPs. But it is a more challenging way to measure ourselves because we include all of the expenses. Most asset owners, especially U.S. pension funds, do not include all their expenses.
That's the important
But
point.
6.7 is the accurate number with all the expenses.
Okay. Does that help for everybody? Okay, we can move on now. Thank you. So we are on 6B, mid-year budget revision, first reading.
So let me have Jennifer Harris, our budget division chief, come up and walk you through the mid-year budget. As you recall, every year we go through this technical process to true up the numbers with the most accurate information we have at this point. So, let me, sorry, Michelle just reminded me that the last item is an action item. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's what everybody was whispering to me that I didn't hear.
That, and I happened to get the whisper.
You got the whisper too? All right, so this is an action item. I need to know the desire of the committee. It's moved by Mr. Miller, seconded by Mr. Jones. All those in favor of accepting the 1819 basic financial statements, say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Motion carries. We will now move on to 6B. And that is.
And 6B is an action item as well. And let me turn it over to Jennifer.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Jennifer Harris. Oops.
You're good?
It says it's on.
Yeah.
Jennifer Harris with CalPERS Financial Office. Agenda item 6B is an action item for which CalPERS requests your approval of the first reading of the mid-year revision to the 2019-20 budget. Included in this item is information on final year-end expenditures for prior fiscal year 2018-19. For the current 2019-20 fiscal year, CalPERS proposes a net $700,000 increase to the authorized budget for a total revised budget of $1,898 million. This net increase reflects adjustments in 3 expenditure categories: administrative operating costs, third-party administrator fees, and enterprise projects. There are no adjustments proposed to investment operating costs, external management fees, or headquarters building costs. Total authorized positions remain unchanged at 2,875. For administrative operating costs, the mid-year revision includes a $1.5 million decrease for revised salary and benefit calculations. When preparing the annual budget in the spring, CalPERS uses then current internal payroll data to estimate salary and benefit increases negotiated through the state's collective bargaining process. These are commonly referred to as control section adjustments because they are authorized by control sections included in the State Budget Act. At mid-year, we revise our estimates for the control section adjustments based on direction from the Department of Finance and using final year-end payroll data per the State Controller's Office. This $1.5 million decrease is 0.4% of budgeted personal services expenses and 0.3% of the administrative operating cost budget. Within the administrative operating cost budget is funding for temporary help, which includes funds for seasonal clerks. This past August, the board inquired about the number of seasonal clerks employed by CalPERS. Page 5 of attachment 1 displays information on the number of seasonal clerks employed over the last 7 years. Since 2012-13, the number has decreased from 160 to 85. This is a 47% reduction. CalPERS will continue to monitor and analyze the use of seasonal clerks and will report updated figures to you in April when we present the 2020-21 annual budget. The next expenditure category with an adjustment is third-party administrator fees. The mid-year revision includes a $2.4 million increase. This includes $1.8 million for health program fees based on more current health plan enrollment data, and $600,000 for the long-term care program to fund additional investigations and a new fall prevention program. There are also some minor decreases in fees for the retiree benefit and pension pre-funding trust programs. The last category with an adjustment is enterprise projects, and this includes a $236,000 decrease for the Human Resources Management Solutions project. This was the second year of funding for a project that was to have begun in fiscal year 2018-19. However, CalPERS canceled the project this past spring because it was unable to successfully negotiate a contract for the work. As a result, none of the budgeted funds from either 2018-19 or the current 2019-20 year have been or will be expended. These three adjustments, the $1.5 million decrease in administrative operating costs, the $2.4 million increase in third-party management fees, and the $236,000 decrease for enterprise projects, comprise the net $700,000 increase in the authorized budget. Moving on to attachment 2, this is the final year-end expenditure report for fiscal year 2018-19. At year-end, CalPERS expended $1,637 million, or 96.4% of the authorized budget. This expenditure level is on target with the key performance indicator to forecast expenses at or below 10% of the authorized budget. At year-end, there was $61.6 million in unexpended funds. Nearly half of this was in the administrative operating cost budget, with $21.2 unexpended in personal services costs for position vacancies, and another $7.4 million unexpended across various OE&E line items. There was also $16.4 million unspent in investment operating costs, $7.4 million for external management fees, and $5.8 million for third-party administrator fees. Further, there was $4 million unspent for enterprise projects, largely due to the cancellation of that Human Resources Management Solutions project. CalPERS recommends the committee approve the mid-year revision as presented, and if no significant adjustments are directed, proposes to bring the second reading directly to the full board in December. The 2018-19 year-end expenditure report is purely for information and does not require action. Thank you. That concludes my presentation on both the mid-year budget and the final 2018-19 year-end expense.
Thank you. So we do have a couple of questions. Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, thank you for the report. And what did you say the increase of in the mid-year budget?
$700,000.
Okay.
And what was the purpose again? I'm sorry, of the increase? $700,000?
So at mid-year, we do some additional calculations. One of the traditional calculations that we redo is to look at the control section adjustments. And these are increases that are authorized for the state negotiated salary and benefit costs. So we do an estimate in the spring, and then we true that up in the fall based on direction from the Department of Finance and actual year-end payroll data per the State Controller's Office.
And what is the running estimated vacancy rate for personnel at this time?
Currently, we are at a 7.6% vacancy rate as of October 31st, 2019.
And that equates to about how much money? You have any idea?
I don't have that number off the top of my head.
Okay. So the reason I'm asking the question is because, as you stated in the 2018-2019 budget, there, in terms of administrative operating costs, those are you spent 94.3% of the budget, which meant that you didn't use all the money.
Correct.
And so I've been advocating this for a long time, that we should use the vacancy monies rather than adding new money, because every penny we add to the budget, we're taking away from the PERF that could be earning a return. So that's why I'm asking the question, is whether or not there's enough vacancy that you could use rather than pulling more money out of the PERF, putting it into the budget.
Right, and I think you've seen us try to take that approach in not bringing you requests for additional positions. So as Jennifer mentioned, this year's mid-year budget keeps the authorized positions at 2875, as you've seen for the last several years. And so we are kind of, in essence, as you've approved additional compensation packages for various staff sort of use the savings to pay for those things, and we haven't come forward generally to ask for requests for additional funding, and we are able to sort of take on additional board requests and so forth by redirecting resources rather than coming in asking you for any additional resources.
Okay.
In addition, I'd like to note that the $61.6 million that was unexpended stayed in the pension fund for investment. Similar to our own personal checking accounts, we might set ourselves a monthly budget for groceries and car payments and mortgages, but if in 1 month we don't spend it, it stays in our checking account and earns interest, very little in your checking account. But in this case, all the money that is budgeted stays in the pension fund until it is actually expended and paid out.
Oh, then that's, I didn't understand that.
Hold on. Go
I
ahead.
didn't understand. So you're saying that until the expenditure is made, that's when you make the transfer out of the PERF into the expendable category to be charged?
It's kind of like a checking account. So once the expenditure is made, let's say payroll for the first month of payroll, it comes out of the pension funds to pay payroll.
Okay.
But the other 11 months stay in there, and then each month it gets paid out.
But that's great.
Yeah.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
All right, thank you. Ms. Brown.
Thank you. I had a question about attachment 1, page 11 of 12.
Yes.
And I do see a tiny little footnote there where it looks like the general counsel's office increased by 10.1%, and the little 4-point font footnote that says redirection of the Information Security Office from Operations and Technology to General Counsel. So remind me when that happened or why that happened, why we chose to do that. Maybe that's
It was over the summer, basically when Liana was appointed as the new information security chief. And I think my understanding, it conforms more to best practices to have reporting relationships separated from the general information technology division. And so largely it is just a display issue that we had an information security office prior to that, but it is now sort of housed within the general counsel's office, similar to the internal independent auditor is within the general counsel's office as a sort of separation from the rest of the organization. So it was over. The direct answer is it was over the summer.
okay. And so Liana reports to the general counsel then, not to the CEO?
Correct.
All right, thank you.
So is this your internal information security? Is that why?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Any other questions? All right, so this was an action item as well. It's been moved by Mr. Jones, second by Mr. Miller. Any comments on it? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? All right, so we'll move on to 6C,
Yes,
board member employer reimbursement.
Thanks, Chair. This is the last action item. This is a request from our Vice Chair Miller to slightly increase his reimbursement rate. I think the materials you have
Explains that.
walk through the explanation.
Did anybody have any questions on that? If not, what's the pleasure of the committee? Moved by Mr. Perez. Second by Mr. Jones. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? And one abstention, Mr. Miller. All those opposed? All right, motion carries. And we will move on. I just want to make sure that's all there. All right. We will move on to agenda item 7A, annual review of funding levels and risk report. Mr. Toronto. I think we're going to have the same.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Scott Tarando from the Actuarial Office. I'm joined today by Randy Zubak, who will help me present the annual review of the funding levels and risk report. This report was developed to help the committee with its oversight of the financial soundness of the CalPERS system. Included in this report are various system-level actuarial results, and risk measures that the board can use to help understand the risk inherent in the funding of the system. When you look through the report, what you'll find is that while the funding position of the risk of falling to low funding levels and the funding positions in the future have improved, risks still remain in the system. Required employer contributions are projected to increase over the next few years, and actual contribution increases could exceed expectations if future experience is unfavorable. Public pension plans, both at CalPERS and more generally across the U.S., continue to mature. Retiree accrued liability to the ratio of the liability to the total accrued liability has increased, as well as the asset volatility. And these increases will contribute to contribution volatility in the future. In addition, concerns about the near-term investment horizon have increased. There's a continuing trend towards lower expected returns, and we see this both across the nation and among other pension systems as they decrease their discount rate. While recent modifications, such as the change in the amortization policy, has helped reduce the risk, employer contributions continue to rise, and from our position, that seems to be the greatest risk on the employers and their ability to make contributions to the system. At this point, I'll let Randy add more context to these general summary comments, and then we can discuss any questions you may have.
Thank you, Scott. Randy Zubek, CalPERS Actuarial Team. Scott did a good job of hitting the key takeaways from this year's report. As he said, I'm going to go through some slides that will provide a little bit more detail. One additional item I'd like to mention before we begin with the slides is that typically from year to year, as we update this report, the key piece of additional information that we receive is the previous year's investment return. That's usually the biggest factor that might result in changes to these results. Since last year's report to this year's report, we have no assumption changes. The data didn't change materially, no method changes, and our investment return, as we discussed at length, was about 6.5% or 6.7%, depending on how you measure it. And the bottom line is that was relatively close to our expected 7%. So nothing in this report this year has changed materially from last year. We're seeing some of the same trends, just a continuation. So let's talk about the current status of the system first with a few slides. Slide 3 shows the funded status of the PERF as of June 30, 2018, as well as some of the significant subgroups of the PERF. And what we can see is that the PERF as a whole was 69.7% funded based on a 7% discount rate. That's an increase from last year, which was 67.9%. Based on a 7% discount rate as well. So we've seen a small improvement, and if we project this forward to 6/30/19 with our 6.5% return, we're at around 70.4% funded. And in addition, in July of this year, we did receive some additional contributions from the state, which would put us at about 71% funded overall as of June 30, 2019. So what we're seeing is a slow but steady improvement in the funded status, which is a good sign, even during a period where we're declining the discount rate. Now, obviously, employer contributions are a big focus of the system. What we have here is a summary of employer contributions as a percentage of payroll, broken down by some of the significant subgroups of the system. And these rates are all a little bit higher than last year. As Scott said, we've seen some contribution rate increases over the last few years. We project there will be a few years more of increases before we expect to level off and actually begin declining. But we still have a few more years to go before we expect that to happen, and that's primarily a result of the discount rate lowering from 7.5 to 7, and our 5-year smoothing process for recognizing the full costs of those changes. So we're still in the middle of that phase in. Here we have a projection of employer contribution rates for the same groups we saw on the previous slide, and it shows what I basically said on the last slide. We have a few more years of small increases, generally a leveling off, and then we begin to decline as our classic members turn over and change into PEPRA members, which have lower costs than the classic folks. Now, again, this is all based on actual experience in the future lining up with our actuarial assumptions. We will get to slides where we vary some of the future experience to see what that does to our results. One thing I'll point out is that a couple of the lines might look a little flatter to you than the others. The state miscellaneous, the state police and fire, those groups are being helped by the significant additional contributions that the state has been giving us over the last couple years. Okay, let's look at a couple recent trends. Slide 6 shows the percentage of our agencies that have what we call negative amortization. And this is something we talked about with the committee back a couple years ago when we talked about changes to our amortization policy. Negative amortization occurs when the required payment that an employer is making towards their unfunded liability is less than the interest on that unfunded liability. It results in an increase from one year to the next in the unfunded, even though a payment's being made towards it. And negative amortization can occur and does occur in our system and other systems, particularly when you're using longer amortization periods or you're using an amortization approach that varies the year-by-year amortization payment, starting at a lower rate and increasing it over time. So we have now implemented a new amortization policy, which the board adopted, which will result in many fewer of our agencies being in a negative amortization position. And as this slide indicates, we're already seeing a decrease, and in the next few years, we expect that to continue to decline. Another positive trend is our employers, first of all, realizing that they can make additional contributions if they choose, greater than what we are requiring them to make in our actuarial evaluation, and also with their understanding of the benefits that go along with that. Not only immediate improvements in their funded status, but also saving money in the long run, sort of like a mortgage on a house. If you can pay more up front, you're going to save money in the long run. So with a lot of educational efforts on our part, I think we've gotten that message across, and a lot more of our employers are making use of that. You can see a steady increase in the amount of extra money we've received. The last bar for 2019-20 is only 3 months worth. We expect that to greatly exceed the prior year by the time the year ends. And since we're on this slide, one additional point I'll make is that we're seeing a lot of increase in discussions or actually implementations of pension obligation bonds. A lot of our employers are looking into this as a way of funding their unfunded liability. If they call and talk to their actuary, we don't recommend for or against that. We give them information to help them make their decision. They generally hire outside advisors to make that decision, but we're hearing a lot more discussion among our employers of making use of that, and in many cases, fully funding their unfunded liability through that process. Okay, as promised, some projections where we don't hit our 7% return. This chart illustrates projected funded status for the PERF on the left side and projected employer contributions on the right side for sample safety and miscellaneous plans. And we're using actual return expectations of between 5 and 9%. So clearly our assumption is 7. That's the solid blue line or green line, I guess, in the middle of these regions. And you can see the variability in the funded status 10 years from now or employer contributions 10 years from now if we earn something other than our 7%. We've selected the scenarios of between 5 and 9%. We expect over a 10-year period that our average will be close to our 7% assumption, but could easily be less or greater than that 7%. There's a very high chance that on average over the next 10 years we will be between the 5 and the 9, but there's no guarantee of that either. We could be outside of this range. Now, as I said, it's likely over a 10-year period we're going to average something close to our 7% return. But of course, in any 1 year, investment return is very volatile. We could easily get a return less than 5% or greater than 9%. So the purpose of this slide is to, again, show you projected funded status and projected employer contributions with a 1 year of either extremely good or extremely bad investment return. And you might look at the scenarios we've selected and wonder, how did we come up with those? They look sort of random. They're actually 1 and 2 standard deviations away from our expected return of 7%. That's why we selected those. So what you can see in these charts is that in one single year, we could have a large change in our funded status due to extremely good or extremely bad investment year. The positive side of this is that due to our 5-year recognition of the costs of an investment loss, you don't see immediate extremely large changes in the employer contributions. They increase gradually over a 5-year period. And the hope would be, if we had one of these major investment events, that during that 5-year smoothing period, we'd have a correction in the opposite direction, which would drive the rates in the other direction. Okay, so the projections on the previous 2 slides were based on scenarios selected by us, and another way of analyzing these results is to perform a stochastic analysis, which is basically looking at thousands of scenarios of future investment performance. And what this slide, what slide 10 shows us, is the probability of the system or subgroups of the system falling below various funded status thresholds, 40%, 50%, and 60%. Now, as the slide demonstrates, it's very unlikely that we would fall below 40 or 50%. Those numbers were quite a bit higher if we went back 5 years or so ago. We've been lucky to have some positive investment performance, and also the new amortization policy protects that funded status a little bit better than the prior policy. Now I want to talk about a few what we call maturity measures. As everybody knows, the system is getting more mature as time goes on, meaning our number of retirees versus actives is increasing. The share of retiree benefit liability versus total liability is increasing. These are expected occurrences. This is not something we try to manage or stop from happening, but these are indications of certain risks that we need to consider going forward. Now, slides 11 and 12 show the ratio of retiree liability to total liability. I'm not going to talk a lot about those, but as those increase, our duration for benefit liability shortens, and our cash flow can go negative, and those could affect our investment opportunities. But what I want to talk about more is the asset to payroll ratio, which is continuing to increase, and it's simply just a plan's assets divided by the payroll of the active members. And this is a really good direct measurement of the expected volatility in future contributions. The higher this number gets, the more likely that the contributions in the future are going to vary more significantly. Again, not something for us to manage. It's just a measure that indicates that we have to be aware that this risk is increasing. We want the assets to continue growing, certainly, but along with that, as they do grow, we have a greater risk for contribution volatility. And as Scott mentioned, one of the bigger concerns with the system is the employer's ability to continue making their contributions. We're hearing that at current levels, some of our employers are financially stressed. They've seen some increases, and they're expecting to see some more increases going forward. And slide 15 has some more stochastic analysis regarding the likelihood of contribution increases of certain levels. Again, this ties to the maturity ratio. They are what they are. Again, if we wanted to try to bring these down, the types of options we would look at would be either increasing the amortization period and spread those costs out over a longer period, but of course we would recommend against that, or possibly moving investments into less risky type investments, fixed income type investments, but there are downsides to that as well. So volatility is something we just have to manage and live with to a certain extent. Well, it wouldn't be an actuarial discussion without some mention of the discount rate. I won't say a whole lot on it. We're using 7%. We're comfortable with 7% right now, but we will be doing our mid-cycle ALM review next year. There are a few reasons here listed on the slide that could result in that 7% coming down. Some of them are in our control, some of them are not. We will just wait and see when we do the analysis next year where we end up. And then I'll just mention really quickly, this is just a nice pretty color slide of the state of California by region, and we show the average funded status of each of these regions for their miscellaneous versus their safety plans. The ranges are not that different. They're fairly tight. I'm not sure what the slide tells us, but this is the type of analysis I think we want to do a little bit more of going forward, maybe in an attempt to identify if any region or any county is behaving differently than the others. But for now, it's just an interesting graphic. And with that, I guess I'll take any questions, and Scott will also help me answer those.
All right, it looks like I have a question. Ms. Brown.
Thank you. I want to go to page 5 of 17. Let me go back. I got to get there. You like doing these graphs, all these little charts? Yeah, I thought
Sure.
so. I thought so. Okay. I like the ones that look like a tornado, by the way. Okay. These recent trends. So is anybody going to be surprised by this number? Are we changing any of the numbers that we're telling, like school officials in the state, that their contributions are going to go? They'd love to hear that they're going down. I'm not sure that's not what we're telling them, but I want to make sure that we're not surprising them with anything new.
Yeah, there should be no surprises in these results. If you went back and looked at our projections from last year, they would be fairly similar.
Love to see variances in the future, like last time. Tell me how good your projections were compared to these. All right, thank you.
All right. Ms. Paquin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the report. I'm curious, if we go back to slide 13, which I think shows potential volatility based on payroll. Does this look at potential for a decrease in payroll in the future, which would then increase the contribution rates?
We do not. We're assuming that payroll will increase with our wage inflation assumption, which now is 2.75%. So we're basically assuming payroll increases at that standard level.
Okay. And do you do any worst case scenarios or anything like that? And I'm just thinking, if we head into another recession, if there's more belt tightening at the local employer level.
And another thing to keep in mind is when we do we moved away from amortizing as a percent of pay to level dollar, so that's independent of the payroll.
Okay.
So your normal cost depends on your payroll. That will fluctuate up or down with member counts and and concerns about payroll going up or down. But we eliminated the risk that if you had a drastic change in payroll, the unfunded would not be getting the correct amount of payments coming in. So the amortization policy change kind of addresses that concern.
Okay, great. And then I guess another question about the impact of PEPR members. So as the number of PEPR members are increasing, do you have a chart that would show something like that?
The only thing in this report that would illustrate that would be on slide 5. I guess I control this right now. Just the fact that these lines start dipping out towards the end of the period is purely an indication that the classic people are turning over and we're getting more PEPR people. But yeah, we're not showing any counts or any specific dollar impact of that.
Do you know roughly what the breakdown is at this point by percentage of active?
I think it varies quite a bit by group. I want to say for schools it's actually fairly high, but I don't have any of that in front of me.
Yeah, I want to say for the state plans, I want to guess around 25% to 30% PEPRA. We're somewhere in that range. Similar for agencies across the state. It varies. I mean, some safety agencies, I know for example, CHP was very on the low side. They have less turnover, and thus fewer PEPR members are coming in.
Okay.
We could look at trying to generate some of those numbers for you, if you like.
Just curious, I think it might be helpful to have that in next year's
Okay.
report.
Well-
And then last question is, how do you plan to share some of this information with the employers, or did you share some of the highlights at the Employer Education Foundation Forum?
Well, in a number of ways. I mean, for example, they can look through the report, but for each agency, we actually provide this type of analysis in their annual report. We look at scenario analysis, and we also do sensitivity analysis in terms of the results for their particular plans. State and schools as well. When we present the items, there's a 5-year, 6-year projection on the contribution rates. Most of these results are just summaries to kind of show you trends, but each plan has the ability to look at the report and see their individual numbers. And if you remember, we've recently released the Pension Outlook tool, where agencies, at least non-pooled employers right now, can go out and they can run their own scenario analysis, and they can get similar numbers as these for their particular plan over the next 10, 20, or 30 years. And so it's both in the report, and they have the ability to use our tool to get numbers as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, a number of these slides were presented at the Ed Forum last month, as well as a number of the division leaders at CalPERS travel around the state for monthly, what we call employer leadership dialogues, where we invite employers to a particular location. We travel down there and we give them about a 4-hour presentation, and this kind of information would definitely be included.
Thank you. I think that would be really helpful too, because like you said, you can always look at the report, but I think that you present it well, and it's nice to have that back and forth dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Paquin. I just wanted to know, before I go on to other folks that want to ask questions too. So we're looking at page 5 still. And I think what's interesting here is we are seeing it, level out, maybe go down a little bit. It looks like 1 or 2 of the plans is going down a little bit, maybe 3. And you say that's because of PEPRA, but shouldn't that also be because of our amortization period?
Yeah, that's a great comment. And in fact, if we extended this out another 10, 15, 20 years, you'd see those lines much more sharply decline as we pay off the 30% of unfunded liability. Ultimately, once we get to 100% funded, the contribution rate is just the employer portion of the normal cost. So for example, CHP, their total rate right now is about 58% of payroll, but the normal cost is only about 20%. So we're trending down to those lower normal cost levels.
See, that's what my next question, thank you for bringing that up, because my next question would be, somebody like a CHP and these safety agencies, the safety programs, where they're so high, there's a risk, there's a huge risk there, as we all know. Are we, and yes, we're looking at this declining, but how long in the future is that? And are we preparing for the risk that could cause of these people wanting to leave the system possibly, or, I don't know what else they can do, but.
Great question. I will say, going back to Scott's comment about the Pension Outlook tool, employers do have the ability now, if they have a non-pooled plan, to do a 30-year projection on their plans and see exactly what's expected and see what will happen under lots of different scenarios. So folks have the ability to model those things. In terms of, how many years can they afford this level of contributions? I guess every employer is probably a little bit different in what they can afford and what they can't. I guess I don't have a good answer to that.
Okay. All right, I appreciate it. Ms. Ortega. Whoops, hold on, I didn't get you. There you go.
Thank you. Before I ask my question, I'll make a comment to Ms. Taylor's point about the CHP. So representing the employer, that is, in fact, if you look at the CHP contract that was approved this year, we made an effort to address that. And the level of their funding is exactly the reason why we had that conversation. And so through collective bargaining, we agreed to redirect 1% of what would have been their salary increase for the term of the contract to prepay a pension liability, in addition to getting additional state contributions to
Thank you.
pre-fund. So I
I
think.
did not. I think I read that, but I've forgotten about that.
Yeah, so it's, having this information does allow the employer to sit down with the employees and consider those types of pre-funding solutions. My question is on attachment 1, and it's, there are two tables there, one on page 17 and one on page 19, and I'm having a hard time understanding the information that's being provided to me on the two slides there, or the two tables. So if you could help me understand. One talks about the probability of a contribution rate increase, I think, over a 30-year period, and maybe the other one is at any one point in time, but I'm just having a hard time what message I should take from those two tables.
Sure. Can you say the page numbers again?
Sure. So it's page 17 of 60 and 19 of 60.
This is single year. Increases over the next 30. And this one is.
Right. So on slide 17, this is the probability of a cumulative increase over the next 30 years of these levels. So what's the chance that, and this could take a period of 2 or 3 years maybe, that the rate would increase, let's say 5% of payroll or 10% of payroll. So it's a probability of a cumulative increase of these amounts regardless of how many years it takes for that to occur. And then on slide 19, these are this is the information that was in one of the slides in our presentation. This is an increase in a single year of these magnitudes.
And these are what-ifs type of scenarios.
This is right. So we have thousands and thousands of investment scenarios that go up or down that our investment office helps us prepare. We just run them all through and then count up how many times we...
You just love running the numbers. Come on. All right.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I
Okay.
think so. I can follow
Go
up
ahead.
with you also. So I have one more question on slide 10 of the slide presentation. The probability of falling below 60% column. So there used to be perhaps a legend or a bit of mythology around once you get to a certain percentage, it's very hard to ever come back to being fully funded. And I wondered what your impression is of that kind of idea that's out there. I recall that going much below 60% starts to approach the kind of danger zone. So,
Yeah, I'll give a quick response and let Scott chime in. I don't think there's any agreed upon threshold that if you go below that, you're in serious trouble, you're not going to recover. It all goes to, again, our concern of the employer being able to continue to make their contributions. The lower that funded percent goes, the higher the contributions go. It isn't necessarily that the funding process, if we fall below 50, won't get us back up to something close to 100, but the contributions that would be needed to do that would be so severe that we may have employers that can't afford that.
Yeah, and to kind of key in on the specifics, when we generated these calculations, these costs, we measured that the event happened, like not necessarily you got out of it. So for example, when we ran through all the scenarios, say for dropping below 50%, if you drop below 50, if some event happened and it dropped below 50%, that counted as an event of one time. We didn't subsequently say, did you get back out of the 50%? It happened and you got to that level. It's just basically kind of reflecting the occurrence of the situation happening.
I see.
Okay.
Thanks.
Ms. Middleton?
Okay. Thank you. Couple of comments. First, thank you for all of the effort that's going into making the future cost known to our employers. I think it's incredibly important. And as I look at the slide on page 18 of 60, I would like to say to all members of City Council in 2026, please say thank you to those of us who did it for you. With that, I want to go back to a very simple question. The 2.75% payroll assumption, what's that based on? How did you do that calculation?
So all of our assumptions are reviewed on a 4-year time frame. Wage inflation or payroll growth being just one of the many assumptions that we look at. It's generally made up of regular price inflation, and there are ways to estimate what that is by itself, and our assumption right now is 2.5%. And then above that, what do we think real wage inflation will be on top of price inflation? And Scott, you can maybe add some comments on the types of things that we look at.
Sure. So when we last did the study, we looked at inflation trends, both historical and projected. We looked at and a lot of information coming from the Fed Reserve in terms of their projections. And that generated around the 2.5% inflation assumption. Then we look at productivity, both for across the country as well as, in California. And productivity is kind of hard because we kind of try and level set where wages are increasing due to productivity versus inflation and or seniority or merit increases. And we kind of, based on our analysis, we landed at around 0.25% on that assumption. There are our experience study that we did in December of 2017, I think outlines our process, and we can forward that to you, and it kind of gives you, I think, a little bit more on the specifics I think you're looking for in terms of what we did, what were the statistics we were looking at, and the sources on where we came up with the 2.5% and the 0.25%.
Yeah. In addition, I just want to say every 4 years when we do that experience study, we also have it reviewed by an outside actuarial firm who also says whether they agree or disagree with our assumptions, and then they agreed with that one.
So are these much more broad economic analysis that you're going through that takes employment across the spectrum, or do you attempt to somehow or another weight it to the fact that we're dealing with public employment, and the trends in public employment can be different than those in the larger economy?
I would say in general, we are trying to identify any differences between our plan members and any other group of plan members. Mortality is probably the biggest example where we know our folks tend to live longer than folks outside of California. And so we look at just our experience with regard to mortality. With regard to wage inflation, I don't know how much that factored into it, probably not as much. But the idea is to project our population. So yes, we would want to take that into account.
And I'm sure I'm, along with a number of others, very sensitive to the fact that labor negotiations have been more difficult in the most recent past, and pent-up demand for pay raises are definitely more apparent today than they were a few years ago. And the demand for increased services, which causes increases in number of employees, are also, there is pent-up demand there.
That's a good point.
The nice part about the pension outlook calculator is we can choose whichever number we want or think is appropriate and start to look at our own individual. So, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Perez?
Hi, Mr. Zubik, following up on what Ms. Middleton just said. So as an employee, let's say I'm the County of Riverside, and I've got a group of deputies negotiating right now. Would it be safe to say that we can just figure a 2.75% increase moving forward until your numbers change?
I'm not sure I completely understood the question. Can you phrase it again?
Well, strike that from the
all right.
Strike that from the record. Sorry. No, go ahead.
Putting you on the hook for a 2.7% raise.
2.75 is our assumptions. Whether a particular agency has increases higher or lower than that, will get reflected, because, if we assume 2.75, if you give everyone, say, a 4%, it's going to show up as a loss, as an actuarial loss, and your contributions will increase. Vice versa, you give everyone a 1% raise, it'll show up as a gain, and those will be reflected as a reduction in your rate.
Okay.
So there's a balancing item. It's not like we're not setting the pay rate for people.
No, I know, but that answered my question. So no, it wouldn't be safe to say just give 2.75 until your numbers change. Thank you.
Yeah, and the other point we should make is that these are meant to be very long-term assumptions, 20, 30 years. We're not looking at the next 5 years or even the next 10 years. So while each individual agency is going to have slightly different experience with these things, we're looking for long-term experience. If you're an agency that tends to, for right now, giving some higher pay increases, you may end up giving lower pay increases after that period. So we're looking for an average over a very long time period.
Perfect. What steps, Mr. Zivik, you mentioned that we, I'm assuming the organization, can take steps into mitigating that potential of lowering the discount rate?
Yeah, I think what I said was, of the 3 bullets that we listed, the capital market assumptions going down was the first bullet, and we don't really have any control over that. Investment consultants will weigh in, and they'll say, this asset class we think will earn this, and that asset class will earn this, and if they lower those projections, that forces us to take that into account and possibly lower the discount rate. The second 2 bullet points are just things that are within our control. If we decide to move to less volatile investments like bonds, treasuries, that would most likely have the impact of lowering the discount rate. Or if the board decided that they wanted a discount rate that built in a margin, in other words, maybe we think we're going to earn 7, but let's assume 6.8 because it's a little safer to do that, to build a little bit of a margin in. And again, those are not things that we're recommending. We're just identifying items that might result in a decrease in the discount rate.
So none of this discussion is foreshadowing of things to come?
Nope, not at all.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Perez. That was an information item. Anything else to add, gentlemen? I have no more questions from the board. All right. Thank you. Mr. Cohen, we are on summary of committee direction. Did you have any?
I do. 2 items, one which I can handle verbally now, and then we'll follow up on the second one. I think we go before public comment.
Yeah, they go before public comment.
Oh, on this particular item?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to do public comment last since we were at the bottom. All right, so let me call the first 2 up for public comment. 7A, Bijan Mayar, if I'm saying that correctly, and Lynn Milstein. Okay, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members. Bijan Mariar with the League of California Cities. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about item 7A, the annual review of funding levels and risks report. As is often said, the employers are the insurers of the state's public defined benefit plan. As you know, these retirement benefits are only as secure as an agency's ability to pay for them. In order for CalPERS to maintain its sustainability and viability for the next generation of public servants, we are committed to working with you and CalPERS staff to achieve that goal. However, as the staff report notes, there are still significant ongoing challenges to achieving this shared goal. Primarily, we at the League are concerned about the prospect of increased employer contribution rates, especially in the context of a shorter amortization period for investment gains and losses and a lower discount rate. To highlight the challenges faced by cities, we have asked several of our members to come speak to you today so they can share their stories. As you will hear, our members are doing all that they can to mitigate rapid contribution rate increases. But there is still more that must be done. We stand ready to partner with this board, the state legislature, and all impacted stakeholders on finding collaborative solutions to ensure a secure and sustainable retirement system for our active and retired employees. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Milstein.
Good afternoon. Lainey Milstein. I'm an assistant city manager here with the city of Sacramento. You're going to hear from our other local government partners who are in the back of the room about the ever-increasing financial pressure as our PERS costs rise and in many instances force difficult choices between retaining employees, funding programs and services, and paying our pension costs. That is an undeniable reality that many cities will struggle to address. However, I'm here today not just to share the doom and gloom, I'm good at that, but to thank you for the work that we've been able to do together already, and to ask that we continue to expand our partnership to move forward. We need and must develop additional tools to help educate our employees and retirees, and to have a chance to actually combat rising costs. To ensure the sustainability of this system, we will need to work collaboratively to educate our stakeholders and find solutions. Employers continue to be challenged to share the financial reality with our active employees and retirees. There is still substantial pressure for wage increases, as our board member Middleton just mentioned, because our employees don't understand the amount of increased funding necessary to sustain their pensions. And we know when the employer is the only backstop for costs associated with the unfunded liability, as you saw in item 6A, I believe it was slide 7 that talked about the growth of the unfunded liability over time, funding wage increases and keeping up with pension costs is an unsustainable level of expenditure growth. The money is finite. So I'm here asking you for help to tell our story. Without easy-to-use tools and infographics, we end up with very complicated explanations that our employees just don't understand and or recognize as pertaining to them. And Board Member Paquin asked a question. She asked how we find out about this information. And those of us who are steeped in this, we look at the reports. We use the financial tools. Board Member Ortega also asked, but our employees are not going to get to that level of sophistication. They're not going to read the 12-page report that was put out by your public information staff on the situation. We've published that same report in our budget at least 5 times over, and it doesn't ring true to them, and we need your help for them to understand how these costs affect us and our inability to combine both salary growth as well as paying pensions. Without new tools to address cost increases, there will be cities that will have to make these difficult choices. And as I said earlier, to ensure the sustainability of the system, we need to work collaboratively to identify the problems and find solutions. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Sarah Lamnan and John Donlevy. No, it isn't. Not our job to do that.
Good afternoon.
3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. So my name is Sarah Lamnan. I'm a city council member for the city of Hayward, and it's nice to see some of you again and to meet some of you new faces. I've testified with the league in the past in support of the discount rate and in support of decreasing the amortization rate. And frankly, it's time, as has been said, that we lower the bill. Each of these approaches, even the trust, is about more money from cities. And we've stood with you to do those corrections, and there has been great progress, and we appreciate all of that. But it's time that we start talking about additional approaches. In Hayward, employees are sharing costs. We have raised taxes. We've continued to lower our expenses. And now we have to talk as a state about how do we lower this overall bill. Any risk analysis, as I'm sure you're all aware, must include an analysis of why the bill is so high and what can be done to mitigate that. And of course, your fiduciary role is looking long-term, but as I'm sure you're aware, there are short-term implications. We cannot make it through that next 20 years of PEPRA sort of salvation at the current rates. So, each of you lives in somebody's jurisdiction, and you feel exactly these impacts on yourself. To pay for your streets, your roads, your libraries, your parks, your police, your fire. And you probably feel it again from your water bill and your sewer bill and so on. And so, you're paying for it perhaps twice and then half again, because as you saw in the slides, these costs are the person plus another 50%, plus another 50+%. And so to get at the next level of risk mitigation, we have to be able to talk about and have those really difficult but collaborative conversations, those collaborative dialogues that you mentioned, to get at the root. So investments that decrease the cost of housing have a ripple effect across all of our jurisdictions. Controlling retiree escalating costs could change our funded status by 10%. Decreasing healthcare costs throughout by preventative services and cost controls impacts, of course, OPEB and other benefits expenses. And so we appreciate the work in the past, and fortunately some of this stuff is in the works, but we really need to get at it sooner, and we need to get it together. Thank you.
Madam Chair and members of the board, thank you very much. My name is John Donlevy. I'm the city manager for the City of Winters. Kind of a perspective, I'm here as kind of a rep for the small towns. We have 38 full-time employees and about a $5 million general fund budget. When it comes to pension, I like to tell people that it's both difficult and complex decisions that we need to make. And the most important thing is seeking balance. As a small town, we are constantly reevaluating our staff. We're looking at consultants versus employees. Most of our new revenues, as we have a strategy on addressing pension, is when we have new revenues coming in, pension's our number one priority. We want to stay funded. We actually have a pretty good rate right now, but our new revenues go into a pension track to make sure that we keep our funding. I will share with you that I think a lot of cities are trying to do the right things. We seek to find the tools and alternatives, and when you hear about the partnerships, I think it's the things that we as employers and you as members of the board can help us with. Prepayments, extra payments that we're doing, 115 trusts. With Pepper, we're keeping our funding levels 100%, so we don't have to deal with that. We address things as we negotiate with our employees based on total compensation. As Board Member Ortega pointed out, the idea of pre-funding solutions. You must have been at our meeting yesterday, because that was one of the things that we really stressed with our employees and on educating them. Educating employees is not easy because it is very complex. They may be really good at fixing water and sewer lines, but when it comes to crunching this stuff, it doesn't help so much. The increasing of rates as a pure solution doesn't work for small cities like us because it has a direct impact on services. In Winters, as an example, our police officers oftentimes are working by themselves. We work at a very bare level. Our firefighters run on trucks with only one paid staff member, and the rest are volunteers. As you look at funding levels and the approach, the increase of purely looking at from a contribution rates standpoint doesn't work. It actually serves as a pretty ominous wave for a community like ours. I'd like to thank you for your time today, and I think the one thing I'd like to stress is just encourage that there's a balance and collaborative approach to all this. I'd like to give a plug for your staff. They're stellar. Mm-hmm. Oh my goodness, they help cities, they keep us balanced, and in the end, it really is us collaborating and working together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So our next two speakers are Steve Schuebauer and Scott Dowell. Thank you, gentlemen. You'll both have 3 minutes.
Good afternoon, board and staff. Thank you for hearing from us today. My name is Steve Schwabauer.
Sorry.
And no problem. I don't think anybody's ever been able to pronounce it right. Usually when they get to Steve and they pause, I say, yes, that's me. I'm here to give you a perspective on a mid-sized city. Lodi's about 70,000 people. First, I guess I'd be wrong if I didn't acknowledge your staff and your staff report and the work that you've done. We as cities understand that you have a compelling need to increase the funded status of your system. We get it. But we hope you do that with an understanding of our ability to partner with you in that path. Lodi is before you today a much healthier city than we were the first time I came to speak to you 2 years ago. Our citizens have granted us an additional $5 million a year in revenue. We've put away $12 million in a pension stabilization fund, and our general fund has grown. Our employees are now paying as much as 6% of 6 points of the employer share. So a much healthier organization from a pension system side, and we've done a tremendous amount of work to address it. But unfortunately, none of that means that we are out of the woods. We're close to 70% funded today, just as you are. However, our pension obligations in the general fund, the $60 million general fund, are projected to go from 18% of that general fund, or $10 million, to 25% of that general fund, 15.5. Before we do anything, before we buy a fire truck, before we buy a police car, before we buy radios, before we buy a mobile data computer, before we build parks, before we manage those parks, before we pay payroll, before we pay for insurance, we're going to be paying by 2025, 25% of our general fund just in pensions. What does that mean for our general fund? Although right now we are sitting on a pretty significant reserve, by 2023, we're probably laying people off. 2025, we're in significant trouble. We're not just laying people off, we're eliminating services wholesale. Even in the face of having worked very hard to do what we've done, and I greatly appreciate Board Member Middleton's comment, and I think it's worth you understanding. My employees have worked without a raise, effective raise, since 2008. They took a pay cut in 2009, 10, 11, 12, and we restored it. And that's all we've done. And you better believe that there is a significant demand for raises, and there's a significant demand to address the staff work that we have to do just to manage the new parks and police the new neighborhoods and take care of what we've built that's caused us to be able to grow. That number that I referenced, that $5 million growth, doubling of our pension costs, that also represents the growth of our general fund. 100% of the growth of our general fund in the next 5 years will be directed to you. 100% of it. Nothing to do anything else with. That's a real problem.
All right. You're out of time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Greetings from the city of Chico. I am Scott Dow, Administrative Services Director for the city of Chico. Recently, our city manager, Mark Orm, invited CFO Michael Cohen, hi Michael, to a Chico Chamber of Commerce meeting to discuss the CalPERS retirement system. During the meeting, some members of the public expressed their grave concern over the operations of CalPERS and the significant contribution increases the city would be facing over the coming years. The public wanted to know how we were addressing this issue. In response, our city manager summarized our city's response over the years, including 1, pay reductions to city staff in 2013-2014, no COLAs for over 10 years, employees now pay their full share of normal costs. Employees also pay an additional 3 to 6% of the city share of normal costs. We pay the UAL in July of each year to save on interest costs. Create a Section 115 trust and contribute based on cash flow availability. Engage CalPERS leadership on ways to collaborate on these issues and challenges. Greater emphasis on our 5-year projections and planning, and creation of a financial budget emergency policy. After the meeting, CFO Cohen commented to our staff on how Chico had done over and above what many agencies have done to address these funding issues. That was good to hear, but it still presented that we still have challenges ahead. Today, I sit here and I say thank you to your professional staff, including Marcy Frost, hi Marcy, and Michael Cohen for their helpful interactions with our team in Chico. But the reality is still this: in the next few years, our UAL payment will increase to $5 million over what it is right now. This is subject to change, as we know the actuarial reports each year update those figures. Candidly, this is overwhelming. Even though we have been proactive to address the issue, it is still a huge challenge for our city and its residents. Residents routinely share their frustration with Chico staff about the pensions and why they will end up paying staff's pensions. In November 2018, our city responded to the campfire in Paradise by providing shelter to over 20,000 Paradise residents, relocating overnight to Chico. Many of the campfire survivors have remained in Chico and now require city services. As such, we have the financial challenge of providing these services with minimal long-term revenue enhancements. Without any change, we are looking at reducing staff and services to deal with the additional pension contributions in future years. This would further frustrate residents who want public services, especially in light of a natural disaster that we've just experienced. In conclusion, please take no additional action to increase financial contributions required by CalPERS members. Thank you.
Thank you both. That exhausts our list of speakers. So, Mr. Cohen, summary of committee direction.
Yes, so on the question of when GASB 67 was implemented, CalPERS did that beginning July 1st, 2013, so that would have shown up for the first time in the 2013-14 CAFR. And then as follow-up information, Member Paquin's question, we'll distribute percentages of PEPR members to the entire board.
Great, thank you. And then I have public comment. I don't have anybody else that has said they want to make public comment. So then I am adjourning this meeting. The meeting of Risk and Audit is scheduled for? 11:30. What do you want to schedule it for? 2:45? 2:45. 2:45. It's up to you, Chair.